राज सुनो, मेरी आवाज सुनो.
The pride that we had because we were there with all the idealism of the freedom fighters, and the fact that we did not become an acolyte either of the US or USSR, the power blocs then, was such a wonderful thing. Wherever we went, wherever we wherever we went, there was so much of the speaker has been lost. Mr. Shyam Saran is not.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So there was like wherever we went, whichever country and whoever came from wherever, we had a sense of pride because the independence not only meant a resurgence on various fronts, it meant a resurgence in our self-esteem. And I think foreign affairs and what we did during that time has a lot to say. Anyway, let me not stand between Mr. Shyam Saran, whom we are really privileged to have amidst us today. So over to you, Shyam. He will speak about Nehru and foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Ashok. And let me say I'm very privileged to have been invited to the series that you are doing on Nehru. This is particularly timely because as we have seen in the past few years, there has been a certain rewriting of the history of Nehru and his contributions to this country, both as a freedom fighter, but also much more importantly, as India's first Prime Minister. Now, before I get into the main subject, I would like to point out that you mentioned that Mr. Nehru was someone who was very aware of what was happening in the world during that time, whether it was, all the sort of impact of the First World War, what was happening in the interwar years, the growth of fascism, of Nazism. He was very much, sympathetic to, for example, the Spanish Civil War. He was someone who was very much a part of the Socialist International that was also active during that period. So here
that
was a
the
person
only effective
who,
answer can be the
leaders
translation
of
of these
India's independence
principles
movement,
into
was
action.
perhaps the only one who
If
had
the bona
a
fides
kind
of the
international
majority, however, are
exposure
doubted,
and
as they might
understanding
well be,
of international
then even
affairs,
pacts and
which
agreements
perhaps
are
was
of little
not there
value.
amongst the
A
others.
general
So this
and
is an
countrywide
important
adoption of
aspect.
central
The
broad
second important
principles
aspect is
can
that
create a public opinion strong
we
enough
had
to prevent even an
bureaucracy
aggressive
which
and
was,
evil-intentioned
in a sense,
majority
nurtured by the British,
from
the
going
Indian
astray.
civil service. There were some very outstanding people, but perhaps people are not aware of the fact that the one important department which used to actually deal with foreign affairs, which was the political department, in the British Indian government, that was almost always staffed entirely by Britishers. So Indians, even though you had a good, and a fairly accomplished bureaucracy, they had very little exposure in terms of, managing foreign relations. So when India became independent in 1947, you had very few people who actually had any exposure, had any kind of experience in dealing with foreign affairs. So this aspect should be, realized by us, because this only sort of enhances the importance of the contribution which Jawaharlal Nehru made to the formulation of foreign policy for independent India. There was, in a sense, there was nothing in terms of, the recent past to go by, or an infrastructure that was already in place which he could tap, unlike the domestic, civil service. So this is something which, when you look at the foreign policy formulated by Jawaharlal Nehru, it is, I think, very important to realize that he was really, in a sense, a pioneer as far as India's foreign policy is concerned. And for many of us who have been in the business of diplomacy, I think what we find very remarkable is that the template which he set in place for India's foreign policy, not only in terms of concrete sort of actions or in response to what was happening in the world, but in terms of a framework which could be used, for actually formulating policies as the world around us was changing. So it was not something which was a kind of a frozen template. It was a template which was capable of actually being adjusted, of being of modified, depending upon the demands, on India's foreign relations. So this is the reason why now, after we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of India's independence, what perhaps is remarkable is that many of the principles, many of the norms which he set in place for working out India's foreign policy, those still remain very valid. We say we are no longer following non-alignment, maybe we are following multi-alignment or multi-vector policy, some people say. But in essence, the principles that he laid down for India's foreign policy, which also, by the way, were the basis for the non-alignment policy that he initiated, these have not changed. And what was that? Essentially, what I believe is that non-alignment, or the policy that we follow even today, is based on the principle of strategic autonomy. And what does strategic autonomy mean? Strategic autonomy means that on issues which are of vital interest to India, India should be able to take relatively autonomous decisions. So this was really the basis of what when he put forward the policy of non-alignment. This was its underlying basis, that India as a civilizational entity, India as a potential big power, having emerged from many decades of colonial rule. You said India was like a slave country. So India, having through this very, very difficult struggle, spreading over many years, when India became independent, when the people of India became a free people, then they would certainly not want that as an independent nation, they should once again have decisions regarding India's vital interests being taken in some other capital. And this is very important to realize. What would he mean when he said non-alignment? What did he mean? That, the world, post-war world, had split into two, competing ideological as well as military blocks. One led by one superpower, the United States of America, the other led by the then Soviet Union. Both nuclear powers as well, with the power to, in fact, destroy humanity altogether. Where was India's room for maneuver? What is the space that India could find in this very highly polarized international environment? And this is why the policy of non-alignment became very important, because it was not only in terms of, foreign policy, but I think it was also responding to a very pervasive political consensus amongst the people of India that never again should we be placed in a situation where the destiny of India, where issues which impact on the welfare of the people of India, that those decisions will be taken somewhere else. I think that was really the essence of the kind of policy that he was trying to follow. This is just to explain, what led him to really conceive of non-alignment as the appropriate foreign policy for India. Now, much has been, of course, written about non-alignment. Much has been written about, Nehru's contributions with regard to, international affairs, that he was a crusader for peace. He was extremely, worried about the new situation that had arisen because of the development of nuclear weapons. It's the possibility that there could be a nuclear holocaust. So he was very, very concerned about the importance of, maintaining peace, of coexistence, because he said the only alternative to coexistence in our world is co-destruction or extermination in a sense. So he was very keen to ensure that even that kind of a confrontation had come about, a polarization had come about. We should, as newly independent country, newly emerging country, we should be a crusader for peace. And it is in this context that I want to talk today about something which has not perhaps been given too much attention, but which I believe is one of the concepts that he pioneered, which I think is very relevant to our world today. As I said, my reading of a lot of what Nehru has written, I believe that one of his very significant contributions was his advocacy of and the concept of one world. Now, Nehru, of course, drew upon the ideas of another intellectual, Wendell Willkie, who had written a book entitled One World. And this was a book which very much attracted Jawaharlal Nehru. And after the Second World War, the Federation of American Scientists, which included even a very illustrious figure like Albert Einstein, also drew attention to how the advent of nuclear weapons had made the establishment of one world a necessity for human survival. This was the view of some of the most eminent, scientists and intellectuals at that time, that the advent of the nuclear age had made the importance of one world something most compelling. Now, what Nehru tried to suggest was that not only in terms of the challenge posed by nuclear weapons, but that the world was moving in a direction, thanks to the progress of technology, towards a kind of a situation where the nation state, with complete sovereignty within its borders, that kind of a state was going to become less and less capable of actually dealing with the challenges of the day. And that there was no alternative but for these nation states to come together, to collaborate together in order to deal with these problems. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is, in a sense, much of the ideas that he came out with in his concept of one world, we are seeing the relevance of those today. I mean, we are going through a global pandemic, the coronavirus. It does not recognize national boundaries. It does not recognize regional boundaries. Only way that any one in the world or any country in the world would be safe is if everybody in the world is safe. So that's the reality, that even if a small group of people in some remote corner of Africa continue to have this infection, it can easily spread across the world. And if that is the case, then there is no alternative but for the world to come together and to ensure that everyone in the world is actually inoculated against this virus. Because until that is done, people anywhere in the world will still be unsafe. So it was this logic of the new challenges that are being spawned by the development of technology, which now we see that we are living in a very densely interconnected, very globalized world. It is very, very remarkable that that Jawaharlal Nehru was so prescient in a sense in not only becoming aware of these challenges, but giving us, a certain kind of solution to those kind of problems. So this is what I want to talk about today. What Nehru was trying to put across was that the experience that he had with India's own freedom struggle, the awareness that he developed, if you see in the discovery of India, the many philosophical concepts which came from our ancient sages. Many people think of Nehru as an Englishman, but you would be surprised after reading Discovery of India. You see how much he was steeped in India's ancient intellectual culture and also its traditional culture. So when he was thinking about this concept of one world, one of the things that he immediately sort of came up with was the principle of Vasudev Kutumbakam, or that the whole world is one family. And also, this was something which was born out of his understanding of the innate criticism of India's accommodative culture, the very easy embrace of very vast diversity, with a certain underlying spiritual and cultural unity. All these, he said, were the attributes that the world must have in order to enable a new kind of world order of free nations, living in peace and harmony with one another. So in that sense, as I said, Nehru was very much ahead of his time, perhaps far more prescient than many other leaders were. Of course, he, as he said, he dreamt of the future of India as a country which was at peace with itself, a democracy which guaranteed fundamental rights of the individuals, which allowed its citizens to pursue their own genius, and a federation which would give expression to the ideal of what was called unity amidst diversity. But one should also recognize that when Nehru talked about the dreams for India, he also saw that this was part and parcel of the dreams that he had also of the world at large. So this is what he said, that, and I quote, "And so we have to labor and to work hard to give reality to our dreams. These dreams are for India, but they are also for the world. For all the nations and people are too closely knit together today for any one of them to imagine that it can live apart. Peace has been said to be indivisible, so is freedom, so is prosperity now, and so is the disaster in this one world that can no longer be split into isolated fragments," unquote. So this is basically the kind of perception that he has and he wants to put across with regard to what the world is like today. So as I said, when today the world is struggling to cope with terrorism, the spread of pandemics, the persisting consequences of first the global financial and economic crisis, then the international impact of climate change. We have just had a summit at Glasgow where we are looking at this new emergency, perhaps even more urgent emergency around the corner compared to the pandemic, which is climate change, the ecological challenge. So there are many of these kind of transnational challenges that need to be tackled, need to be dealt with. And it is in this context that I find Nehru's pronouncements on this concept of one world particularly relevant for today. So it was in the Quit India resolution of the 8th of August 1942, which was passed by the Congress Working Committee, that Nehru spelled out in some detail the idea of one world and what it may look like. He, of course, drew a considerable amount of inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi's own belief in and commitment to the principle of non-violence and the need to ensure that the means and ends were mutually aligned. Even though there was a realistic acknowledgement that the ideal of one world would be a long and arduous quest, but it was argued that nevertheless it must be articulated as a vision to aspire to if the world was to escape from the cycle of hatred, of fear and destruction. So the resolution, which was in fact formulated by Jawaharlal Nehru, states, and I quote, "The committee is of the opinion that future peace, security, and ordered progress of the world demand a world federation of free nations, and on no other basis can the problem of the world be solved. Such a federation would ensure the freedom of its constituent nations, the prevention of aggression and exploitation of one nation over another, the protection of national minorities, the advancement of all backward areas and peoples, and the pooling of the world's resources for the common good of all. On the establishment of such a world federation, disarmament would be practicable in all countries. National armies, navies, and air forces would no longer be necessary, and a world federal defense force would keep the world peace and prevent aggression," unquote. So this is a kind of a manifesto that that was put forward in the Quit India resolution. It was right in the middle of the Second World War, by the way. So having outlined the contours of this proposed world order and its institutional makeup, what the resolution recognized, of course, was this was currently impracticable. As I said, I mean, there was a world war raging at that time. And so it said that the committee regretfully recognizes, however, despite the tragic and overwhelming lessons of the war, and the perils that overhang the world, the governments of few countries are yet prepared to take this inevitable step towards world federation, unquote. So it was not that he was just a kind of a wild dreamer, fantasizing. He recognized very, very clearly that this was something which was obviously not practical for the time being, but then important that this vision should be articulated and always kept in view. So the independence of India in 1947 coincided with the efforts to build a post-war international order and to promote lasting peace and security. And this provided Nehru with an opportunity to try and shape the newly sort of established United Nations as an initial building block of an eventual world federation. So he saw the creation of the United Nations as an international multilateral organization as perhaps the first step towards that particular realization of the particular vision that he had. Despite some misgivings about various elements in the UN Charter, Nehru actually turned out to be a very enthusiastic supporter of the new organization, accepting the structure of the UN Security Council with its veto, as we know, of the members, permanent members, the five, victors of the Second World War, in a sense. And he saw this, he said, as a temporary detraction from the democratic principle. He welcomed the United Nations as a forum where independent nations could meet and deliberate on global issues. And despite the overweening power and influence of some of its members, He believed that the UN represented world public opinion, and that in itself was a factor of restraint. So this is something that he, in fact, mentioned quite frequently. And under Nehru's leadership, India launched into perhaps the most active phase of international diplomacy, just as a newly independent country. And that particular period of intense activity perhaps remains unmatched even to this day. From the time he headed the interim government in 1946 and throughout the decades of the 1950s, India put in a remarkably intense and focused effort into promoting universal rule-based systems and norms at the UN, which could eventually lead towards the one world envisaged by him. The early phase coincided, for example, with the framing of India's own republican constitution, and Nehru consciously regarded this exercise also as a template for the one world he had in mind. Now, an important aspect of this exercise was the incorporation of fundamental rights in the Indian constitution, even while India led a diplomatic offensive at the UN for the negotiation and adoption of what was the historic covenants of the universal human rights. In their original form, these were to be implemented through the UN Security Council, but later the responsibility was shifted to the General Assembly. Due to East-West differences and mistrust and concerns over violations of national security, the idea of covenants was initially given up in the favor of a universal declaration of human rights, though a covenant was eventually adopted much later in 1966. But what is remarkable is the extent to which Nehru was willing to accept derogations from national security in order to promote his one world ideal. Now, at a time when national sovereignty is almost like an overriding principle over everything, it is quite remarkable that as the leader of a newly independent country, he was already thinking in terms of some limitations, some restraint on the exercise of national sovereignty for the larger good, for international peace and security. In his way of thinking, human rights of individuals across national boundaries had to be safeguarded and upheld by an international body in accordance with rules adopted by the Committee of Independent Nations. Success in this endeavor could then be extended step by step in other domains. Now, in playing this advocacy role, of course, Nehru was very conscious of the enormous challenge of trying to build consensus in a world which was already fractured into, as I said, opposing ideological and military blocs. There was a pressing need to generate a worldwide movement which would transcend this expanding polarization and enlarge the middle ground of peace and cooperation. Now, Nehru worked on this on both regional as well as global tracks. A great believer in Asian resurgence and solidarity, he first tried to mobilize the emerging countries in the continent in support of this ideal. And, for example, if you take the Asian Relations Conference held in New Delhi in March 1947, Nehru said, and I quote, "We have arrived at a stage in human affairs when the ideal of that one world or some kind of world federation seems to be essential, though there may be many dangers and obstacles in the way. We should work for that ideal and not any grouping which comes in the way of this larger world truth. We therefore support the United Nations structure, which is painfully emerging from its infancy. But in order to have one world, we must also in Asia think of the countries of Asia cooperating together for this larger ideal," unquote. Now, it is in these early years of India's independence that the principle of non-alignment as the basis for India's foreign policy began to emerge. In Nehru's view, the only way in which India and the emerging countries could play the role of a reconciler, of a consensus and bridge builder, was by keeping aloof from opposing ideological and military blocs. So non-alignment, in a sense, was a logical corollary of this approach. At the same time, Nehru did not want non-alignment to be interpreted in a negative sense. Thus, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, or Panchsheel, which were adopted as part and parcel of the India-China Agreement on Tibet in 1954, and which these 5 principles were also further elaborated at the subsequent Afro-Asian conference at Bandung in 1955, became, along with non-alignment, the instruments to advance the cause of one world. So non-alignment, as far as Nehru was concerned, meant the rejection of competing ideological and military blocs. Peaceful coexistence meant the active pursuit of peace and cooperation while respecting ideological differences and social systems among nations. So in 1957, Nehru's influence reached its apogee when the new General Assembly adopted by consensus and transcending the Cold War divide, a resolution incorporating the principles of peaceful coexistence and the need for all states, members of the United Nations, to work together to actively strengthen international peace and developing cooperative relations. So it was, as you are aware, in 1961, Nehru joined Yugoslav's Tito, Egypt's Nasser, Ghana's Nkrumah, and Cambodia's Sihanouk to establish what became known as the Non-Aligned Movement, and which turned India's own choice, foreign policy choice, into, in fact, an international movement. 25 countries took part in that first non-aligned summit in Belgrade in September 1961. And this was a very important building block in Nehru's mind of this one world that he had envisaged. So it brought together an increasing number of newly independent countries into its fold, rejecting the Cold War and sharing a vision of equitable and just international order, which recognized the indivisibility of peace and prosperity. The non-aligned movement was visualized as very powerful support to the United Nations, generating a kind of a moral force and international public opinion in favor of this one world idea. So this is in a sense, how he sort of expanded, evolved this particular concept. Now, the other aspect that I would like to recall is that he, as I mentioned to you, that he was always aware that these principles that he was talking about would be very difficult to maintain in practice. And he was constantly saying that, yes, we may have to make compromises, particularly for national interest reasons. But even when we are doing that, we must always keep that vision in front of us. We should not forget that even if we are in a sense moving away from, departing from that particular principle, that remains our lodestar or a guide. Now, the tragedy is that this very nuanced distinction that he wanted to maintain, that okay, we have this ideal, but maybe there are some practical reasons why we cannot always follow it. What really sort of shook his faith in taking this concept forward, this ideal forward, was of course the 1962 Chinese attack against India, and the shock of that particular attack led Nehru to, in fact, very very drastically, in a sense, revise his views. Confronted with what was then considered an existential crisis for the country, Nehru implicitly criticized his own earlier advocacy of the one world concept in words of considerable sorrow and disillusionment. So what did he say? After 62, he said, and I quote, "We were living in a world of illusion. We were getting out of touch with reality in the modern world and living in an artificial world of our own creation. We have been shocked out of it," unquote. So, because of 1962, the pendulum, in a sense, swung completely to the other side, that, this was a concept, or this was a notion which was in the sense like a fantasy, and we have been shaken out of that fantasy. So what is noteworthy is that even while the one world concept, as a result of what I said happened in 62, receded into the background, some of the building blocks that Nehru put in place to promote its realization did survive and gain strength in the succeeding years. The Asian resurgence, for example, which he considered indispensable in the remaking of the world order, is a reality today, even though it may be remaking in ways that Nehru may not be very comfortable with. The non-alignment movement, of course, survives only as a pale shadow in the post-Cold War era. But, its rhetoric still resonates among developing countries across the world. India may now call itself, as I mentioned, multi-aligned, autonomous, but the fact is that few Indians would be comfortable with the idea of their country as a junior partner in a military alliance or acquiescing to the hegemony of another power. That remains very much, entrenched in the Indian consciousness. So what is missing is the larger frame and worldview in which Nehru tried to locate India's pursuit of interest. Now, one of the important aspects that I wanted to also draw attention to is that I mentioned how his concept of one world was also linked to the Constitution of India. I mean, the whole aspect of that what we have in the Indian Constitution in terms of rights, in terms of even looking at India's own destiny as a free nation, as part and parcel of a larger saga, international saga, which was taking place across the world. Even though that is the case, what is very interesting is that after 1962, the 16th Amendment in the Constitution in 1963, which was adopted, and this amendment retroactively added specific language throughout the document to preserve and maintain the sovereignty and integrity of India. So look at the impact that it almost completely swept away the concept of one world. And the Constitution of India itself had to be, amended in order to give greater sort of force, greater prominence to the aspect of preserving and maintaining sovereignty and integrity of India. So principles actually of a very typical nation state, So this objective now assumed priority over any other objective. So the Westphalian state, the nation state, which Nehru had tried to slowly move away from, had reasserted itself. Now, was Nehru a romantic idealist who exposed India to avoidable dangers in the pursuit of this unattainable one world? Does the idea of one world hold any contemporary relevance? Is there any merit in revisiting the ideal of one world as articulated by Nehru to refocus international attention on current global challenges and the need for collaborative responses to tackle them? I think this would be a worthwhile exercise in order to really look at a sort of a balanced reassessment of Nehru's place in history. So even though Nehru himself chose to abandon the pursuit of one world as unrealistic in the wake of Chinese aggression against India, there were other causes for India-China conflict. Of course, I don't want to go into many of the reasons for that deterioration in India-China relations to the stage of actual armed clashes. But what I think we have to recognize is that in sort of the pendulum swinging to the other side, perhaps many of the other things which in fact today are so compelling, many of those other things Nehru also, almost like throwing the baby with the bathwater, he also stopped, in a sense, in the few years that was left to him, to stop talking about some of these aspects. For example, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the threat of nuclear war so terrifyingly close. This was precisely the kind of nightmare that was always working on Jawaharlal Nehru, and was one of the, in a sense, one of the drivers of why he was thinking of one world. And yet, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and you had this possibility of a nuclear holocaust, Nehru's voice was not heard, and this happened really because of the fact that he had been so disillusioned by what had happened in '62, that even though actually the kind of scenario that he had thought about was perilously close, we don't have a Nehru's voice anymore, really talking about it. Now, as I said, even though Nehru himself may have moved away from this concept, why do I talk about it today? It is because many of the reasons why he mentioned that this concept of one world was important, in fact, those reasons have become far more salient today, far more compelling today than they were during his time. As I said, Nehru was prescient in looking at how dramatically the dawn of the atomic age, how dramatically it had impacted on interstate relations. The reason why it was important for human survival, for countries to, at least to some extent, be able to collaborate together. So you today have the issue of climate change, as I mentioned. There is the larger ecological crisis, the loss of biodiversity. We have a public health crisis, a pandemic, which does not recognize national borders. So if you are looking at the whole series of challenges which humanity as a whole is facing, which are also our challenges as India, there is really no alternative to collaborative, global, cross-national responses. So in that context, going back to some of those ideas which Jawaharlal Nehru came up with in developing this concept of one world, I think is very, very today, very, very relevant. Now, I want to end with something which is not perhaps immediately relevant to this concept of one world, but it is sometimes said that Nehru's perhaps was not fully 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 aligned with India's own, millennial sort of a culture, its traditions, that he was not fully in tune with the kind of cultural drivers of India. He did not really understand, in a sense, the complexity of India. Now, in that context, when I was reading The Discovery of India, I came across one paragraph, which actually the words were very, very moving. They certainly were very, very moving to me, because in a sense, they demonstrated the deep understanding that Nehru had, in fact, of India's soul, in a sense. And I just want to end, therefore, with those lines, because I think in paying what was a very eloquent tribute to his mother country, but it is also a very perceptive description of its civilizational quality. And I think all Indians should actually read these words, because they are also very, very inspiring. So this is what he says. And yet India, with all her poverty and degradation, had enough of nobility and greatness about her. And though she was overburdened with ancient tradition and present misery, and her eyelids were a little weary, she had a beauty wrought from within upon the flesh, at the deposit, little cell by cell, of strange thoughts and fantastic reveries and exquisite passions. Behind and within her battered body, one could glimpse a majesty of soul. Through long ages she had traveled and gathered much wisdom on the way, and trafficked with strangers and added them to her own big family, and witnessed days of glory and of decay, and suffered humiliations and terrible sorrow, and seen many a strange sight. But throughout her long journey, she had clung to her immemorial culture, drawn strength and vitality from it, and shared it with other lands. Unquote. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Shyam. It's so wonderful. I have a bit of a lump in my throat as I speak, because I mean, to think that so much thought went into, what the shape that India was to be in, and so on and so forth. And I'm very happy that you have, like we had decided, not to compare it with today. Otherwise, the lecture actually could go on, because there's so much that is there to be said. And I've heard you before on the subject. So, but I guess there is a bit of a limitation of time. But thank you so much for such an enlightening, short expose of Nehru's mind when it came to international affairs. His immersive view, his inclusive view, not the inclusiveness was not only meant for India, that's what I understand, but for one world. Now, there are some questions. One question is, but you have in the process already answered it. It was, one world is an accommodative version. Mr. Mathur is asking that. One word is an accommodative vision. How does it reconcile with self-interest and the non-aligned concept espoused by Jawaharlal Nehru? Would you like to say something more on the subject?
So Nehru did not reject self-interest. What he said was, nations should work in their enlightened self-interest. And that particular adjective is very important. So it is not saying that countries do not have particular interests, or that it is, illegitimate for them to try and pursue those interests. But he also felt that in pursuing those interests, the sort of notion of, or the awareness of, the interests of others also must be kept in mind. That it should not become a completely sort of competitive situation. So when we talk about today, for example, of some of the challenges which we are facing, take for example climate change. Now, I have been a negotiator on climate change. Every delegation, every delegate, what is the brief with which he goes to these negotiations? His brief very simply is give as little as possible, extract as much as you can. Now, if each and every delegation which is in these negotiations follows this particular directive from its government, then you should not be surprised that we end up with a very least common denominator result, which is what you see has happened at Glasgow. When actually most of the challenges that we confront, and which is what Nehru was trying to put across in his own way when he talked about the concept of one world, was that most of the challenges that we face are actually existential challenges. That it's not that by giving as little as possible and extracting as much as you can, you are in any way helping your own country. You are safeguarding the interests of your own country. Because the safeguarding of those interests of your own people, the welfare of your own people, is in a certain way linked to, integrally linked to, you're also being able to contribute to the welfare of people of other countries. So you cannot, as I said, if you're looking at today, the pandemic, no country is safe unless every country is safe. So when we are talking about enlightened self-interest, it is that, yes, India must inoculate as many of its people as it can. Certainly, that is an important objective. But at the same time, it is in India's interest that it contributes to the inoculation of peoples in many other countries, if it can, if it has that capability. So that is where enlightened self-interest comes in. So that is, at least, that is the way I understand what he was trying to put across.
Yeah, thank you again. Shabnam Hashmi says, thank you, Shyam Saran, excellent. And there is another remark, a comment, which says that are the civil servants of today, do they know anything about the idealism and the concept of Nehru? I wouldn't like to drag you into this at all, Shyam. I mean, I don't think, just a minute, having experienced there's another question. Having experienced a pandemic situation recently and seeing the role of an organization like WHO, one realizes as to how important the concept of one world is. Unfortunately, the principle was not carried through by all. But that's also a comment. Now, may I request my audience that you can unmute yourself, but please one by one. If you have to ask anything or if you want to make a comment, please do it now. So unmute yourself and ask, and you can whatever. Hello, is there someone who wants to ask a question? I hope everybody...
I have a question.
Yes, Manas.
Yeah. Question is that, is today's, how different is today's Indian foreign policy from the times of Nehru? And if it is different, then in what ways, sir?
Yeah. Well, obviously, the way foreign policy today is formulated and the way it is implemented cannot be the same as in Nehru's time for two reasons. One, this is a very different India today from what we were, say, 50 years ago. This is a very different world which we are living in compared to what the world that Nehru was living in. So it should come as no surprise that there are, in fact, significant changes in the manner in which India's foreign policy is formulated. But what I was trying to point out was that even though the details of the policies that you are following may be different from what they were in Nehru's time, the principles on which these policies are formulated, in fact, you find a remarkable consistency, a certain, kind of continuity. And that continuity is what I mentioned, that Nehru felt that India had a destiny as a great power because it was a civilizational state. It was a country with a large area, large population. It had certain, sense of itself as a major civilization. Therefore, it was destined to play an important role in international affairs. Not only that, it must play an important role in international affairs because if the world is so interconnected and getting more and more globalized, you cannot opt out of international engagement. So even in terms of, safeguarding your national interests, you have to be engaged with the rest of the world. So in that sense, if you look at what are some of the principles underlying India's foreign policy even today, it is remarkable how much it is based on the principle which I mentioned, that on issues which are of critical interest or vital interest to India, India should and must, in fact, be able to take what I call as relatively autonomous or relatively independent decisions. Why do I use the word relative? Because you are in a community or in a family of many nations. Now, if you are interacting with a whole group of other nations, you cannot, in fact, define your interests in any absolute manner. Even the most powerful country cannot, because you have to take into account and somehow try to reconcile your interests with those of other countries. But having said that, it is very important, and this is what Nehru emphasized, it is very important that having come out as an independent country after years of struggle against colonial rule, India and Indian people would not want that decisions, as he said, regarding their own destiny should be taken in some other capital anymore. Earlier, it was being taken in London. It should not be taken in another capital. So in that sense, that principle has not changed. Successive governments have tried to precisely do that. How do we maintain that independence of action, independence of thinking with regard to the issues that we are dealing with? And in terms of the mechanics of the foreign policy, the importance attached, for example, to multilateralism, the importance attached to the United Nations, these have remained important components of India's foreign policy.
Another question that we have here is, how did newly independent India's diplomat pick up the reins of the British-run political office? Was Nehru involved in setting up the IFS?
Yes, in fact, the Indian Foreign Service was entirely the creation of Jawaharlal Nehru. As I said, the political department of the British Indian government had no Indians. There were a couple of Indian ICS officers who had served in international positions. Like, for example, you had a Agent General of India in Washington, Girja Shankar Vajpayee, for example. You had trade agents, some Indian trade agents in various countries. But there was no core of, diplomatic personnel. So it is Nehru who created the Indian Foreign Service. He personally actually interviewed a number of people who were then taken into the service. Some were ICS officers, like Haksar, for example, but others were people who had come from other, walks of life. For example, he also recruited a number of people who had served, say, in the Indian Navy or in the Indian Army before India became independent. They were inducted into the service. Yeah, you had even some of the former princes who were also made part of the service. So he personally sort of assembled the first group of India's professional diplomats, put them through the paces through some very rigorous training, both in India itself, but also sending them in the early days. They were sent for courses in international relations in places like Oxford or Cambridge. So he actually personally made virtually wrote out the charter for the Indian Foreign Service. So we had very small beginnings with a very small cadre of people, but it is thanks to him that what would be the norms on which foreign diplomats, Indian diplomats would be hired, what kind of human resource training they have to be given. All that was worked out by Nehru himself.
My name is Alok, and I have a question.
Yes.
We often hear of Nehru as a global personality. My question is about the impact he made on the practice of international relations globally.
Well, what Ashok mentioned right in the beginning, that one of the things that he remembers is the sense of pride, seeing Nehru in the role of an international statesman. And by the way, I mean, there was genuine respect for Nehru as a statesman by people who were inspired by him, but also people who were deeply opposed to him. You had the United States, for example, which had no, patience with his idea of, non-alignment. So he was very, very much respected across the world. And this, in a sense, enabled India, which was just a newly emerging, independent country, to really punch above its weight. India, as a newly independent country, was playing a role in, for example, the negotiation of major international norms, international instruments at the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was actually an Indian contribution. Not many people know that. So it was very much the kind of standing that he had internationally. As not only a leader of 350 million, 400 million Indians at that time, but somebody who also thought very deeply about international affairs, about international peace and security. So there may have been differences of opinion with his ideas, but he was always very much respected as a international statesman. And as we have seen, the role that he played in sort of creating the non-aligned movement, bringing many non-aligned, many independent, newly emerging countries together and in one fold, making them a kind of a very important force of international public opinion. They may not have been militarily powerful, they may not have been economically very powerful, but working together, they had a voice in the international councils, which otherwise, as single countries, they would have never had. So that was a very major contribution, and that was really thanks to essentially his own personality and his almost like being a very charismatic leader.
Thank you so much.
Professor Rohit Prasad has put in a question, but before that, may I just take this opportunity to welcome Professor Aditya Mukherjee, who is going to be our speaker on compulsions in the context of Nehru's economic policy. So I will include him. I'll unmute him as well as give him the video, please. Please do so, Mr. Adit Mukherjee. So we'll come to you, sir, in a minute. The question that Dr. Rohit Prasad, Professor Rohit Prasad has asked is this. I think it voiced by many. Was Nehru's approach to Kashmir and China above reproach? Yeah, actually, let me start by saying in hindsight.
Okay. So, I have made this point very frequently that it is very easy to have 2020 vision by hindsight. We are not always aware of what may have been the context in which certain decisions were taken or not taken. But I certainly, looking at the history of that period, and having done some work in looking at what were the train of events which led to the Kashmir crisis, there is no doubt in my mind that we perhaps did not follow what today seems to be the right kind of policy with respect to Kashmir. So one was that in delaying the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to the Indian Union, that delay was not justified. And perhaps if that delay had not been there, some of the problems which we later faced may have also not been there, because he wanted to insist that accession will be accepted by India only if Hari Singh, the Maharaja of Kashmir, agrees that Sheikh Abdullah would be the popular leader of the new state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, as we have seen, later events show that his faith in and his support for Sheikh Abdullah was not necessarily something which was well thought out. Second was with regard to the sending of the Kashmir issue to the United Nations, because that really tied our hands. And there, I think he misjudged the role of countries like the United Kingdom and the United States of America, but chiefly the United Kingdom, which played a very, very devious role on the Kashmir issue. Why? Because by that time, the Cold War had already begun, and India, being non-aligned, was seen as detracting from the ability of the West to confront the Soviet Union, the other superpower. So it was, Pakistan was seen as a very important ally in terms of that larger geopolitical game which was taking place. Perhaps despite his historical sense and even feel for geopolitics, this was perhaps one issue on which he failed. With regard to China, again, I think there was some misjudgment on his part. His instincts were right. People who say, oh, he was, somehow, very starry-eyed about China and India-China relations, Hindi chini bhai bhai. But if you see his writings and his pronouncements during that particular period, you see that he was always very much aware of the fact that China, particularly after it had occupied Tibet, is going to be a major challenge for India. But it is also true that he was fully aware that India simply did not have the capability, certainly did not have the military capabilities to prevent China from taking over Tibet. That capability was simply not there. Secondly, he also failed to realize when the Dalai Lama came and sought shelter in India, that looking at this from the Chinese perspective, who were very nervous and anxious and very, very, shall I say, insecure about their control over Tibet. He did not see that the way in which the Tibet problem was evolving, that this would have an impact on the boundary issue. So the kind of skirmishes which were taking place on the border, these were just ordinary skirmishes. Even if you look at Chinese archives at that time, they were not looking at a possible war with India in order to resolve the border issue. But the same archives show very clearly that once the Tibet revolt broke out, and particularly after the Dalai Lama was given shelter in India, the Chinese began to see whatever was happening at the India-China border as a direct threat, not so much in terms of what was the border issue, but what with respect to Chinese position in Tibet. That was not the intention of India. India certainly did not have the intention to challenge Chinese control over Tibet. They could not have. But that is how the Chinese looked at it. And perhaps I think Nehru's failure was not to see these aspects in terms of the relationship between India and China. Of course, he was also not properly, in a sense, supported by his intelligence, people, by people in the defense ministry. I mean, there were those shortcomings, but at the end of the day, he cannot escape responsibility. There was a misjudgment, and we have paid very dearly for that misjudgment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Such a comprehensive answer, and thank you very much for this, because this concerns, and this is Dr. Rohit Prasad has voiced something which a lot of people would like to ask.
Yeah, sure.
Let me, Shyam, just 1 second, there's a new message. Okay. Now I'm getting a lot of messages thanking you, saying it was excellent and all that, and which it was almost goes without saying. But what is wonderful is we are basking in your glory, which is they're thanking us. A lot of people will benefit the way your audience has benefited from you today. It was such an engaging session. It was such an enlightening session that I can't thank you enough for the session, Shyam. And you have really raised the esteem of the platform, if I may say so. Thank you so very much. And thank you very much, audience. You have been